Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks. I'm your host, film culture critic and journalist, Carolyn Hayes. And this is the podcast slash YouTube channel where I speak to film creatives around the world about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today I'm very happy to be joined by my fourth production designer for interviews, Neil Patel, to talk about his work, his decades-long work in not only in Hollywood, but also in Broadway, because he does stage productions in North America and around the world. And I'm very excited to be able to talk to him. And he has a new production that he's worked on for BUGHOUSE, and it's about the reclusive artist Henry Darger, who is considered an outside artist in the arts community because he became more well known after he died, very much like Van Gogh and a lot of artists in the past. So I'm very happy to be able to talk to Neil about his work and these very visually interesting productions he works on. But first of all, thank you for joining me, Neil. Yay.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Carolyn.
Thank you. I usually like to start off by asking my guests to say a bit about how they got into their fields of work and how they got involved with the film industry. And because you're a production designer, you work not just in set production, as in films and for camera, you work in stage production as well, you know. So you have like this, I think, a very much more vast knowledge of stage production as a visual art form. So tell me a bit about what got you interested in being a production designer.
I started, yeah, I actually went, my very early educational direction was art and architecture.
Mhm.
Um, I was I grew up in, my father's from India, my mother's English. They immigrated to the United States, and I grew up in Wisconsin, surrounded by Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. In fact, the school I went to was designed by Tallius and Associates. So the first kind of very, creative entry into the world for me was architecture, because that was such an interesting thing to see when I was very young. So I went to college to study architecture, but I always loved film and theater, and my parents took us to a lot of theater, and I went to college to study architecture, and then someone asked me to design a set
Mm.
because there was a lot of undergraduate theater, kind of like experimental stuff, all sorts of stuff, fun, crazy stuff. And because I had the skills, I agreed to do it. And I found I just really loved not only making a set for a play, but I love the idea of applying design and architecture and understanding of space to tell a story and to reflect a character and an emotion. So I got into theater design that way. And then I went on to pursue it more serious. I finished an architecture degree, but I went on to uh, study it for a couple of years. I lived in Italy, in Milan. I went to the academia there because I wanted to live there for a while, and I had studied Italian, and it was free, so it was a fun. And I learned a lot of very old-fashioned, traditional, like kind of operatic stagecraft because I was in Milan. And then I came back to the United States and finished my degree at UCSD, at University of California, San Diego, where I studied with a very well-known opera designer, Robert Israel, who just coincidentally designed a lot of beautiful pieces with Martha Clark, who directed BUGHOUSE. So I had a long connection to her through
Mm.
that. And then eventually I made my way back to the East Coast, and I lived in New York, where I still live. I moved to New York and really worked for a good decade in off Broadway, downtown theater, eventually some Broadway, opera, live, very much focused exclusively on live performance. And my entry into production design was through writers I knew. There's not a lot
Mm.
of crossover with directors necessarily, or designers even, but a lot of writers, especially in New York, it seems will come out of the theatrical world and cross over to film and television.
Mm.
So a couple of the writers I worked with, Warren Light, who I did his Broadway show Sidemen, he became a television showrunner, and then Neil Labute, who I designed a play for in New York, um, also, well, writes and directs his own pieces. So they both, around the same time, asked me to work in film, and I really didn't know a lot about it, but I had done one small feature, low budget feature where I had to do everything. So I kind of understood what everyone's job was, but on bigger production, there was a lot to learn. But it was a very natural transition for me. And the first time I did it, both on a feature with Neil, and then I did In Treatment, an HBO series with Warren. They were great. I felt like I love designing live performance, but I felt like I'd found my ultimate calling. It was like, oh, this way of designing for camera really makes sense to me. I kind of felt like I understood it, and really enjoyable also. One of the reasons also I left my desire to be an architect and work in theater and film is I love collaborating with people, and even like the social aspect of working in either art form is really rewarding. Just you kind of develop these long-term relationships with directors, with actors, with other creators, and that I found incredibly rewarding. And then from those early projects, I went on to do more feature films and television, and which took me a lot. Most of the work actually was in New York, but I did a Bollywood film, Dil Dhadakne Do, with Zoya Akhtar, which was, as those bigger Bollywood features tend to be, was all over the world. We were in Turkey and Italy and Spain, and of course India.
My God.
Yeah, that was, and then in the United States, I've worked in all over the New Orleans and Pittsburgh and Baltimore, Boston, New York, wherever the work takes me. And my most recent projects were a feature film called Drag, which just opened at South by Southwest, and Hershey, which will come out in the fall, about Milton Hershey. And then I did a series for Netflix based on Jhumpa Lahiri's Unaccustomed Earth, so a series of short stories. So that's where I find myself today. So
You've had such a very vast and interesting career. Literally take you all over the planet, right? And I think that's one of the things about possibly production design, like the type of production design you do, especially because you're doing stage production. You get to travel all over the world to do all of these productions, which I think is interesting. And we're going to get into that, but something I want you to talk a little bit about is architecture, just that history of architecture and how that plays such a big part in film production. Because the thing with film production is you need to understand the physics of how things work, what is physically possible to achieve with regards to production design. You might have a director might have all of these big grand ideas about, I want to do this thing, and you have to be like, actually, this technically, we understand what you mean, especially if you're doing in like practical effects and practically building versus using like VFX and like that can do things that physically can't be done in the real world. I want you to talk about how important architecture is for you as a basis, as a production designer, especially for the skill that you do, because what is required for the stage is different to what is required for what is filmed on camera, because there's different requirements physically and visually what we as people can perceive. And a lot of that has to do with how things are built, So I want you to talk a little bit just for like people watching, like to get an understanding of like how architecture physically plays a part in production design.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge part of it. And it was something that, because I came from architectural background, was really helpful. Because in a way, like you said, like the craft of designing for stage or designing for camera is completely different. We bring along a lot of the same skills in terms of interpreting a script and collaborating, but the actual way you make it is totally different. And I think the biggest thing, architecture became really helpful in film, even more so than theater, because the camera experiences space in real time, and there's a lot of filmmaking technique you can do to manipulate the way we understand the space, but the space is the space, and you have to see it. It has the scrutiny of the camera is much more intense than the human eye from a distance in a theater. So you have to really understand the mechanics of how everything works, from the from the kind of layout and spatial arrangement of a set to the hardware and the details, because you're going to see them all and they all interact, they all play in the story. So understanding of architecture is, I think, really essential, whether you're building sets or you're shooting on location, because even on location, you need to figure out. For instance, the film Drag we did all took place in one house. And the house we found was like tonally and the way it felt and looked on camera was perfect for the story. But the layout of the house didn't work with some key points of the story. So I had to build walls and doors where there weren't walls and doors to make certain sequences work. So you really had to understand, like the architectural background really helped me figure out how to integrate those elements into this location so that the audience would never be aware that there was anything added. It would all just feel like the natural flow of the space. So that it also helps, like in prep or when you're looking at with the director and the DB how you're going to shoot something, you kind of have to think about how the audience will understand it through the camera so that you plan your shots in the way you do it that makes the architecture make sense or makes it not make sense if that's the intention. But it's all, I think we all, when we watch a movie, especially in spaces, we kind of make an imaginary ground plan in our head, like that's where the bedroom was. How did he get there? Especially when you're doing things like which I recently did, which Drag was, where it's a kind of a horror thriller, like relationships of hallways to doors to rooms, really, really important in creating tension. So yeah, so that's a really fun part, and I love making. I mean, we on especially and like on a accustomed Earth where there was a main house that played throughout an entire season. The design of that house on stage was like critical to make it shootable, but make it interesting for 8 episodes. So you want in the architecture of the set, you want to create enough interest and enough ways to see it that it never becomes boring. There's always things to discover in it, different ways to photograph it.
Yeah, like I saw some of the I was sent like the file for Drag, showing like the production ideas you had, like how, and it's so interesting to see how you pre-visualize what you want the house to look like because of the type of film you're making. And I thought it was interesting because when I'm reading a book, I do visualize what the spaces look like that the characters are in. Like sometimes some writers are very detailed in how they'll say the walls have this texture, where a kitchen is, like where the cabinets are, where the fridge is in relation to like the counter, and where that is in relation to like the dining room, like the hallways and doors. And then sometimes there's writers that don't go too very much into details. So I kind of like build like my own floor plan in my head. So like looking at the like the images that I was sent for Drag in particular is so interesting, where you already have the physical layout of an existing house, and you have to reconfigure that in your head. Like you said, because Drag is a thriller, it's a horror film, you have to reconfigure and reimagine how this house works as a house for a thriller, because in the original, the way how it looks originally, because the house is open plan, it's like lots of glass and metal, and it's a very modernist house. I would say probably more like mid 2000s, early 2010s design. So it has a very particular look and feel of that era. So it was interesting to say how like you have these open plans and you're like, nope, we need to make the hallways smaller because hallways bring tension, especially if you drop the lighting and you make and with the music and how all of that feels. And that was interesting for me to see. There's even like an image where it was like the arrow that you use points to like a plug, and you're like saying, no, take the plug out. We don't want the plug there. So like even for there's the physical things that you want changed, but then there's also things that have to be changed in post-production, like where it would either get covered over by VFX or like the set designers. So we need to talk a bit about that, about just like visualizing how a space looks for a particular genre of film. Because like for me, I would say, but why can't this house work as a thriller as the way it is? But you're like, no, we need hallways because hallways bring tension and hallways bring more, depending on how it's filmed. And you're like, we kind of just want to change the sofas a little bit, bring in a wall here. So talk to me about that, about just reimagining a space for a different purpose to fit a different genre of film or TV show.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But so, I mean, the tension in this film is these 2 women have broken in to rob this house. And then, through throwing on her back, Lizzie Kaplan's character, it complicates how they get out. But you also don't, we discover the house in the bathroom. We don't know anything about the house except what they've described in the car before. So the way we introduce the house through the scenes is really specific visual story. But one of the things that's really important in the architecture is, if you're trying to escape, how do you get out? So if it's too open and it's too obvious how to escape and too easy to escape, then it just deflates the tension. You need to get a sense that there's this hallway and it goes through a staircase and this staircase goes through another hallway. And we're not even in a way, you need to make the space a little bit unknowable to the viewer so that they're always anxious about, how are they possibly going to get out of this place? So that had to do with, like you said, building plugs, building doors where there weren't doors, creating complexity in the space, and also, of course, the way it's shot, so that there were hopes, the second floor of the house, we had the big open plan. We only see one part of it, and we never really understand the rest of it. And also, because the character details were really important, because the owner of the house, whose character name is Man, played by John Stamos, is an artist, and he's also in the script. They point out that he's exhibited at PS1, so he's a serious artist. Like he's successful, and so the art collection he has in the house has to reflect that, so that we start to and that's the first thing we start to see in the second floor is what art does he own, and this is clearly a wealthy person's house, worthy of robbing, or it will be successful robbery if you take something.
The Robin Hoods.
Yes, exactly. And then as we go into the first floor, we start to see a more expansive collection, and the art gets stranger and quirkier. And there's even some, we had to recreate a medieval painting of a woman with the devil coming out of the bed. And we used a Bruegel painting that had a lot of, at first reproduction. At first it looks like a Bruegel painting, an older painting, but then when the camera goes into detail, you see these kind of sinister things are happening. So that also creates tension in the course of the film. And then when we get into what I call his salon, that's where I really wanted a lot of wood and kind of to offset the glass and the steel of the rest of the house, and then just the garish colors of all his paintings. So we covered an entire wall, just plastered it with his paintings. So it's really strong. And then he has very kind of unusual furniture, kind of mid-60s, mid-century, but kind of quirky. And we start to kind of understand there's something up with this guy. And then, of course, when we go into the basement where his I would call his lair, but it's actually his studio, that it's kind of a chaotic, inside the consciousness of somebody very, very, with a lot of things going on. For inspiration for that set, I looked at Francis Bacon's studio, which is actually recreated in Dublin now, but you can get great photos of it, which is like a kind of a artist, maniac, hoarder vibe. So the piecing together of all those spaces was really important, and not only revealing the house, revealing the character, but also constantly adding tension.
And you mentioned something that I was actually going to ask you a bit later, but I'll ask you about it now because it ties into this. So you mentioned the art and how the art, as the different floors of the house has different types of artwork and different genres of artwork to kind of show the progression of this character's psyche, the character played by John Stamos. I haven't seen the film, but I'm visualizing it in my head from the images that I have, the file. And something that is fascinating to me about filmmaking, I always say that I see filmmaking as alchemy, because you're building universes and worlds and all of these sets and everything from nothing, and with regards to nothing, just from the idea and the concept of the filmmaker, the production designer, like you, the costume designers, we as human beings, we create from nothing. A dress doesn't exist until it starts being made, it exists as a concept in our head, but a dress doesn't become a dress until it's actually made. In our head, it's just an idea. It has no form. It has no visualization, no tangibility to it. And I want to ask you about just and for filmmaking in particular fascinates me because there's sculpture, there's paintings, there's 3D art, there's like video games, all of these things that we as humans do, we bring from nothing to something. But I find film interesting because film is like you have to do all of these things with a very particular goal, and that goal is having audiences see it on a screen. They're not interacting with it in like we can go to a museum and see a sculpture and walk around a sculpture and visualize a sculpture. Like in like for a stage play, even though the stage play is just a stage, so it's more like in a 2 or even 3-dimensional space, like because the audience only interacts with it that way, but the audience can still technically interact with the stage because we can hear the sound of the stage, we can hear the actors walking on stage, we can hear the dresses, their clothing making sounds on stage, the actors interact with the audience. But for film, we don't interact with we interact with what's on film, but what's happening on film happened months or even years ago, so it's not an immediate interaction. Whereas, as I said, in a museum, you're interacting with the space and the art as it is. So I want to ask you about that. How, like, what is that like for you, knowing that you're making art where the audience isn't immediately interacting with it and we're only interacting with it like on a screen? Like we don't have any tangible interaction with the space versus like going to a museum or to like a Broadway stage or an interactive space like the BUGHOUSE production for Henry Darger, and I'll ask you something else about that later, but I want you to talk about that, about just like how you as an artist think about the way that audiences interact with your work, like from film versus stage versus like interpretive space.
Yeah, I mean I think that's the huge. I think when I started working in film, that was the big that that point you're bringing up is I think the most important thing to realize as a designer when you go working, because you are designing for the camera, not for the human eye. And all the aspects of that are really important, including like what's the aspect ratio, what is the frame, because in a way you're making thousands of little paintings, right? You're making two-dimensional images. So you're image making, you're not making spaces. You're making. I always actually I taught a class last year at NYU, and I would about production design class, and I always remind the students, like, don't get too like the set is important, but the set is made to be photographed. It will never be experienced in real time and space by the audience. So you need to really think about how it'll be photographed and how the composition of the space will look in the frame that the camera produces. So that is cute. I mean, what's fun about it is there's also a lot of like you said, alchemy or trickery in filmmaking, is you can make spaces look really different than what it's like to experience them in real life by the way you frame them, way you film them, the way, you can make a big space look much smaller. You can do a lot of things. And usually is driven by by the story, or the emotion of the scene demands a certain feeling, right? So it's that, yeah, I think that's a huge thing. I would say it's like really, when you design a set for stage, it's like this tangible physical thing. You can control it, right? You're the artist, you make this, it's like your sculpture and you control every element of it. And it's only seen by people, and where they're going to sit, right? So you understand all the elements of how it'll be perceived. In film, you don't, as production designers, we have no idea in the beginning how the film will be edited exactly, how exactly it'll be shot. So in a way, you create like an atmosphere more than a pinned down idea, architectural idea. You create like a look and a feeling with all the element tools you have, which include sets, locations, graphics, set decoration, all these aspects. That's what I find. I think that's what I really love about production design is in a way, it's like the lack of control is exciting because you can help, or you can create those images with so many different tools. So yeah, I mean, it's when I go back and forth between the two different forms, it's what I'm always struck by. I'm 90% of my time I spend now as a production designer in film and television. But when I do go back, like with BUGHOUSE, when I do go back to the theater, it's always I'm always struck by how different the crafts are, how different it is to experience space in person
Yeah.
from on camera.
Yeah. And the thing about film is like, and I love set design because I love paying attention to really small details like cups and like figurines and like it's like doing almost like a Where's Waldo kind of situation when I'm watching films. I'm always like, ooh, does this thing have a different meaning? And I wanted to ask you about that because like in some of your projects, like you mentioned in Treatment, and in Treatment is an interesting show because most of it takes place. If I remember, I didn't see all the episodes, but I do remember a lot of it took place in the therapy room, because
Yeah,
it's
it's
about
his
this like
office.
right.
Yeah.
So it's about this psychologist, and each episode is him dealing with different patients, and all of them are just like completely have ridiculous situations. And he himself, as a psychologist, has different, like completely different
Yeah,
ridiculous
he has his
situations as
issues.
well. But the thing about that particular show is that's interesting is it's almost like a stage production because it's all in one location. So like nothing really moves, the furniture is where the furniture is, like the props are where the props are, but it still operates as a show. It's like a stage production, but it's a show at the same time. Whereas you have shows like, for instance, that you've worked on like Pretty Little Liars, you've done projects like King Shaka, and you've done and like Dickinson, and I watched some episodes of Dickinson. And the thought that occurred to me that I don't think I'd ever thought about before in watching this and in thinking about how your work as a production designer works is in a show like in Treatment and on stage, and I would say even in like the immersive productions you do, the camera only moves in a very limited way because the space allows for very limited movement of the cameras because cameras are huge and big, unless you're using like a steady camera, you're holding like a camera phone, it can't move certain spaces. So you as a production designer have to make sure that we get all the information that we need about these characters based on what the set design is telling us. Whereas a show like, for instance, like Pretty Little Liars or even Dickinson and films that you've worked on, the camera is moves in like a 4D in a 4D direction. But also you take us through different spaces, like the homes have multiple rooms, and like in drag, like the camera moves through the spaces. Now, you get exterior shots, and a production design also applies to what's happening outside of the physical spaces of like buildings and homes, and I don't want to ask you about that, about how you as a production designer have to think of how spaces change because of where the camera is taking us. Like the directors and the writers, they're telling a very particular story based on which rooms we go into. A story in a dining room is going to be different to a story in like a living room. The story that's taking place in a barn, for instance, using Dickinson, is going to be different to a story taking place in like a pub. Whereas in a show like In Treatment, that space is telling us everything that we will ever know about these characters. We don't know what their exterior lives are like because the camera doesn't take us there. So I want to ask you about that challenge, and about the challenge of thinking everything is being told in one spot and one location versus you're getting different spaces to tell different stories on like a film set or a TV show on like In Treatment. Because In Treatment is kind of like an anomaly of a show itself. There's not many shows that take place in one location. There's films, but not many shows that do it.
Yeah, no, it's a very unusual format in Treatment. And it was interesting because that was one of the first, I think that was the first project I did as a production designer with a built set. Because before I was doing much smaller things where we were using locations we couldn't afford. So building that set was really, it's like you said, on some shows you're in so many different spaces and you use the spaces to create constant visual storytelling between exteriors, interiors, large spaces, small space. You can kind of build and weave together a narrative of the spaces. But when you're in one space, then the pressure on that space is huge because the thing about In Treatment when I started working on it was, the fear is like that show had every week 5 episodes, right? Like he saw his four patients, then the fifth show of the week was in his therapist's office. That was the only other space we saw. I think once he went on a train. It was a funny show. We never left the stage. So
yeah,
I think there was this episode in the Irfan Khan's one where he went to like an interrogation center, etc. But anyway, yes. So I actually worked very closely with the director, showrunner, well, with Warren, the showrunner, and also with Paris Barclay, who was director then, who was very kind with me, teaching me that some of these aspects of production design is where is the camera going to be? Where is his chair? What are we looking at? So that we could really compose the frames. Because as you said, the camera did not move around a lot in that show. It was more static. It was more back and forth between the two characters like a play. So you had to be very, very aware of what was going to be in frame, around Gabriel Byrne's head. And it's tricky also because it's a therapist's office where therapists don't tend to want to reveal too much about themselves to their patients. So how do we make, we did a lot of, fortunately it was in a Brooklyn brownstone, which is architecturally interesting. So there are a lot of surfaces, a lot of things we could do with color, dressing. We did a lot of bookshelves, objects, some of, a lot of art. I spent a lot of time with the set decorator, and we had an art consultant looking at contemporary art by, we went to a lot of galleries in New York to find art we could license that would just be, therapists tend to put art in their office that it is a little anodyne because you don't want to upset anybody. Yeah. But at the same time, they want to be things that you can kind of lose yourself into a little bit in camera. So yeah, that was a big deal in that show, was really figuring out how to make, and also to make a set that can sustain that many episodes and always interesting to look at.
Yeah, and in talking about the art, I'm talking about drag again. And I think there's actually a commonality between drag and BUGHOUSE. And that's in the artwork is very, very not abstract, but it's very disturbing visually. And because they're representing the psyches of these people, like for us, drag is a fictional story, so it's about a fictional character. Whereas in BUGHOUSE, like Henry Darger was very much a real person, and no one that knew him could speak to his art because he kept his art for himself. His art was only discovered.
Yeah, it's discovered after his death. Yeah.
After his death by his landlord, right? And so the thing is I wanted to ask you, like, you mentioned just now, like, about getting licenses for artwork that you're going to show in like films and shows. And I'm very interested about that process because, like, how do you decide what you want to license versus how you create? Because in looking at the drag file, it seems like there's some original pieces created for the film. And then there's some that I guess you would find from existing artwork by artists that have them in like museums or in selling them and stuff. Whereas for BUGHOUSE, all of that art is purely original art from Henry Darger, and it's made with the permission of the, I guess you could say, like the estate or the company that has control of it. So talk to me about just like the process of selecting the art and how you want to go about making art. Because again, I have a thing with sharp edges. I prefer curves or rounded edges, and sharp edges make me feel very uncomfortable. And there's some of the pieces in the drag set are sharp,
really sharp,
and it's telling you about and even again, without watching the film, I'm already getting a sense of who this man is. Like the facade that he has is being told through his art. There's the sophisticated art, like the Baroque art, the fancy art you'll find in like the Louvre and like those kind of, and like the Guggenheim Museum and the ROM and stuff. But then like on the other levels, the darker levels, like that's the more visually disturbing art that makes you wonder, like, what is wrong with this? It's like, does he need to be psychologically evaluated? And there's the paintings, but there's also like the sculptures. Some of the sculptures have a lot of sharp edges. And, and so I wanted to ask you about that, like just figuring out like how these artworks play a part in telling us who these characters and these people are, and how you want to like this and design around them. Because again, like BUGHOUSE, and then you also did another immersive. You've done a few other immersive
theater of the David Burns piece,
like the David Burns musical and stuff. And so like, how do you go about deciding these are the pieces that I want to tell this particular story, especially when there's so much artwork to go through, like you have to be very limited in what you want, and you have to tell us a whole story, even just through these artworks.
Yeah, no, well, it's an interesting commonality between these two projects because, which I actually started around the same time, interestingly, is that, so we have the fictional artist in drag, and then we have the real Henry Darger. And so obviously the artwork in BUGHOUSE is Darger's artwork, which we project all over the set. And the space is based on his real space, which was this intensely, densely cluttered, layered, like
Mm.
one of the most intricate set dressing projects I've ever encountered, embarked on. Um, and then in drag, like you said, there's different types of art, and that was very specific. The first type, like you said, are things that look like expensive museum gallery pieces that tell us the status of this guy. So those were a combination of licensed art that we reproduced and a couple of paintings that we made. And also the set decorator, I think her husband had a painting. Like we pulled from we spent a lot of time with the directors, with Ravluv and Greg, like reviewing all the art, where it would go. Um, because we had a month of prep in the house itself, I would make a copy of the painting, tape it up to the wall, and then we walk around and say, okay, this painting will be here. So when we come around on this shot, we'll feature this. So it was very specific evolution of those pieces. So there's licensed art, which we chose, licensed made art, which you have to be careful because can't look like anything that you'll get in trouble for copying. But we were looking at we were looking at a lot of mid-century abstract American painters like Cy Twombly or Rothko or things like that. We didn't reproduce those artists, but they were inspirations for something we made. But that takes a long time to get that right. But we worked on that. And then downstairs there are these sculptures, and there's one small sculpture that has a very important
The
meaning.
pointy green one. It looks
The
so
green one. Yeah.
Just looking at it makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm a very visual person, and I'm sure there's a word for it or whatever, but like when I see those kind of things, I imagine like somebody falling and hurting and impaling themselves. Like I also have a very dark. I watch way too many horror. That's the problem. But like
you're on the right path.
Yeah, I see that. I imagine someone falling and getting impaled on it. I'm like, ah.
Yeah, that sculpture I designed.
Oh, I saw the sketch for it. I'm like,
yeah, I designed that, and I worked with the two directors. One, Greg is a animator, so very visual person, and so we worked together on that. And then I modeled it in 3D, and we made it. Our Ben Bornstein, our special effects designer, made that and painted it. Then there's a giant sculpture in the kind of atrium of the building. I also designed that and had that made. So there were a few things that we created, and fortunately we had enough time to work on them to get them right. It's always tricky making art. You really want it to feel to the audience that it's real, right? So are real enough that we go along with the story. So that those were, and then the older art, like of course. The Bruegel is something that is actually public domain. You don't have to license it. You can use older paintings. And then we created the small devil painting. So a different process. Oh, and then most importantly, the man's paintings, which were created by Greg, our director. So we went through a long process of, because he's a visual artist as well. He did some versions, and we all talked about like, well, what we liked and like, kind of zeroing in on the exact style of those paintings, the palette of them, because they're kind of a wild palette, which we don't see until that point in the movie. Everything before we get to that point is super controlled. The other thing that was interesting about that house is all the glass. Everything was shot at night. We had 21 night shoots. So in the kitchen, instead of a backsplash, it's a window and you see out into the woods. So you're always aware. What's really another thing that really creates tension in that movie is that the house is so secluded that there's no help coming, and that you see that it's completely surrounded by woods, which of course, our DP lit at night, so you kind of are always getting glimpses of it when you're in the house.
Yeah, I'm like, when, like for me as a Black person from the Caribbean, when I see those kind of houses, I'm like, those kind of houses, you see them too much in the horror movies, and say like that house means death. That's
totally. It's funny, the homeowners were this couple, and one of them was, I think, from the area originally, and the other one was person was from I'm trying to remember, from Venezuela, actually, from Caracas. So I was asking him, like, how is it like to, what's it like? You're from Caracas, you're from a tropical country, and you're living in this house in the woods. And he says, "Oh yeah, I hated it for years." It's like I got used to it eventually, but it was funny. He's like, it was so foreign to my sensibility to live in a place like this.
Yeah, for us, like, because in the tropics, like, people, I think North Americans have this idea of like the tropics of like, because you're like in the tropics and everything, you're open up because you want to hear nature and stuff. No, we actually close our houses in. It's all
Yeah,
concrete. And because we build not only to keep bugs and stuff out, but also because like our concrete houses and stuff are provide temperature control, right? Because
right.
concrete is a way to like it keeps the house cool even when outside is super hot. And like a lot of our, depending on like the traditional architecture, like in the Caribbean, I'm from Barbados, so a lot of our architecture is both a mix of like British architecture, because Britain colonized the island, but also has a lot of West African influences and a lot of South American influences. And like we have like the louvers that we use for windows. A lot of our houses have like decorative blocks that allow for air to flow through in the top. And like for us, that's how we interact with nature. We open our windows, we hear the birds, the crickets chirping, we get the fresh air coming through, the decorative blocks and all of that. But we don't really need to see the
Yeah,
forest,
you don't
because in
need
the
to be that
forest is where
exposed.
things in for us in the forest is where things lurk. And
Right. Yeah.
so like those kind of, so like when I watch those kind of films for like North American and Asian, to a lot of East Asian and like Korean and Japanese and Chinese, they use like the forest and stuff very much to the effect of like something there and dangerous is
Very bad. It's going to come out of this.
right. And
That's
so
great.
and the other thing I want to ask you about that is another thing, another interesting aspect that we've touched a bit on, but I want you to kind of go in a bit more, is like how you have to use like art design and the physical spaces to tell us the psyche of who these people are. Like you're translating again for a film like Drag, or for a show like in Treatment, or even like Dickinson and all these other projects you work on. You're telling us where these, especially it happens a lot in bedrooms, you're telling us who these characters are versus from what we see, because we as human beings, we decorate our spaces with things to
Oh,
reflect
sure.
who we are, especially, and not only the things that interest us, but where we are mentally. Like if you're feeling sentimental about something, you keep it, or sometimes people keep things as mementos to remind themselves, don't do this thing, or whether this thing is good or bad, we keep mementos. So as a production designer, you have to come up with a way to tell us who these characters are, the things that that matter to them, and the things that kind of indicate like this person is a villain, this person is a hero, this person is like having depression, this person is experiencing something very traumatic. And that this is again where I kind of see Drag and BUGHOUSE varies in very similar ways, because BUGHOUSE is showing the art of Henry Darger, and Henry Darger is a enigma to people. People can only speculate on who he was as an individual based on the books that he wrote and his journals that he wrote and these kind of things. But he's not speaking for himself. He can't tell us if the interpretations are correct. So as the production designer for a project like BUGHOUSE, you're telling us the audience of who Henry Darger is based on the artwork that is very carefully selected, because he made thousands of art pieces.
Yeah.
And he kind of reminded me of, again, like a film. I did an interview last year for a film called Art for Everybody, and it's about the life of Thomas Kincaid. And he's another person that's considered an outside artist, because he created commercial art that that literally thousands of people bought year round around the world, because a lot of his art was about Christmas and like these Americana iconography and that kind of stuff. But he had a whole other life of artwork that no one knew about until he got sick. Like he did a lot of paintings that are very similar actually to the artwork in Drag. A lot of his work is very abstract, but it's also very dark, and it features like a lot of different watercolor, a lot of different mediums like watercolor, collages, and all these things. And Henry Darger, he used a lot of watercolor as well, and like it's interesting where sometimes like for a lot of artists, the things we see don't really reflect who they are, because like they keep the most personal art that really speaks to who they are as artists and the things that they're struggling with to themselves. So for you, like talk to me about how you have to select. You talked a bit about it, but I want to talk specifically to like people who have the responsibility that you have is to tell us who these people are versus through the work that they're showing, especially when this is in relation to an actual human being who exists. He was a living, breathing. He had feelings, he had thoughts and emotions, and you don't want to manipulate the audience. You don't want to manipulate people's expectations. You want to stay true to who he is, but you can't talk to him to find out if you're on the ball. So talk to me about that, just about having that responsibility of telling audiences and viewers and people interacting with these spaces who people are through art, and like how that kind of balances, how you have to balance that, like it's for entertainment, but you still have to keep a humanity about it.
No, absolutely. And well, that particularly in BUGHOUSE, because Darger, well, there's an incredibly detailed archive of his apartment by the Intuit Museum in Chicago. So I had access to every single object that was in his house, every piece, every magazine, everything, which was incredibly helpful. But then the creative part and the selective part for me as a designer is to pick which things will be featured and prominent in the set to the audience. And that, because we're not making a documentary, we're making a work of art about this artist. So there were certain things in the Darger made his paintings by doing carbon transfer tracing of a lot of commercial art, even like pattern, cutout dolls, all sorts of things he found in his world, and which is so fascinating because the thing that's ultimately so fascinating about it is that he never made any of this for anybody but himself. No one had ever seen anything he'd made until he died, and it was discovered by his landlord. And some of the paintings were 10 feet long, like they were elaborate, beautiful works of art. So for me, it was really important. I wanted the audience to kind of understand where that imagery came from. So it was where we placed those paintings. He had a whole wall just covered in like magazine covers and newspaper articles and things that were part of his inner life, that were things that he used actually to make his art, but they were things he was obviously fascinated. His long book he wrote was about an army of young girls fighting this kind of tyrannical overlord. So the images of the young girls came from illustrations, commercial illustrations. So I wanted those to be, and it's theater, so you don't get up close like the camera does in film. So those things needed to read from the audience so we could see that, I put a little cutout doll in one place and the wall. And, we kind of selected very carefully where these things would be. So they kind of helped the audience piece together the story of who he is. And then just the magnificent collections of like stacks of National Geographics and newspapers and things. So you understand like the obsessive quality of the person, and these things. And then the other imagery that was really important was he had a huge conflict with his faith, but he was a deeply religious person, very devout Catholic. So the rosary beads and the Madonnas and all that imagery was really important to be evident in the set. So that as the viewer, if you walk in, you don't know anything about Henry Darger, you start to understand who this person is. And then spatially, I made the set very, very small, like very unusually small, so that it had a real compression and kind of claustrophobia, so that you kind of like all these ideas in his head, his creativity is kind of exploding in this very constrained space. So there's a real tension there in the story. And he, our performer had a dance background. So he actually was like, had no trouble navigating the space because he's very aware of his surroundings. So yeah, that was it. And then the other thing is just always important, is just the tone, the color. How does it make you feel? Color is our most powerful tool. And with Darger, it's like there's just the kind of the actual house was very, very colors very warm almost in a burnt sienna. And the director and I decided to desaturate it and take it not to black. We didn't want it to be black and white or not monochromatic, but to a super desaturated state, so that when the images of his artwork pop out in the projections, because he used vivid, like really electric colors, that there's a real explosion of color onto this set that seems like very desaturated.
And that's interesting to me, because in looking at his paintings, like his colors, his paintings are not only very saturated and have a lot of color, they're also very visually busy. Like they're very detailed, and like they have so many small. Again, like I made a kind of like the Where's Waldo reference, and like his artwork is kind of like that. There's all of these paintings. There's all these little, almost like, is it tryptograph? I think it is, where you have like the dots where like the pattern changes based on how close you go.
Oh yeah, exactly.
So his painting is kind of like that. And like to hear you say you actually decided to put it in a small space is interesting to me, because as soon as you said that, it made me think of how our brain is small, but we have like what I call a universe of potential with regards to anything that we can create in our heads, right? So it's like I kind of thought of it like, it was in my head. I was thinking, wait, did he do it because like he's kind of representing Darger's mind? His mind, like the mind has a limited space because our brain is limited, but the potential for what can be created through the mind is infinite. So you have all of these big paintings, like they're big, and like some of them are really big, and like even if they're small, they're still really super busy, and there's a lot of information, but you keep it in a contained space. Am I on the right track in my interpretation of it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly, I mean, that's absolutely what I was trying to do, because I think there's something, his work is so fantastical. And, besides the armies of girls, he had these fantastical dragon creatures and people with butterfly wings. I mean, it's like a really, really, really whimsical, but like you said, like a vast universe, a vast, fascinating universe, all made in this like cramped little space by this man with, very modest means. He worked as a janitor. He had very little social life, and everything, all his energy, all his intellect and creativity went into making these paintings. So I think that's the kind of it's like the miracle of art, right? Or the human imagination, that all that can come out of this like dingy, crazy hoarder, almost slightly bigger than a closet apartment. Which I thought the tension between that space and then the kind of wild imagery he created was really strong.
And tell me about how production design allows you to do that. It allows you to not only tap into your artistic side, but to like, because you're working on so many, no project is ever the same, because each story that you're interpreting visually is different. Like there's the TV shows, and then there's the films, and then there's the productions, then there's the immersive space, and each of them requires something different, because each story is requiring something different. Like I watched some clips of it's called The Great Indian Musical, Civilization to Musical, on YouTube. And I noticed that for some of the production design, the stage production design is interesting. But what I thought was really fascinating is you took the production up onto the roof. Like there's lights that shoot up and like expand across the ceiling of the auditorium, and you do that. And like, that's the way how you take a limited space and you expand it out from just the stage itself, and like you make it kind of immersive in that way, for you, because you move the audience's eye from the stage up and makes it more interactive in that way. And like, again, like and for like, it's the David Byrne Theater of the Mind experience. That's interactive, but in a very different way, because you have the actors interacting with the set that they're interacting with each other as well as the audience. And then there's another one. There's BUGHOUSE, and like, so all these different things. But you like talk to me about how your work gives you a way to kind of tap into the potential of your mind. And sometimes like you don't know something that you'll imagine until you're actually working on the project and you get an idea. And you'll be like, this never occurred to me until I've actually started working this project. So talk to me about that. Like, how do your work allows you to basically tap into the limitless potential of your own imagination, where you surprise even yourself with the things you come up with, like pointy, scary sculptures that just put me on edge.
Yeah, well, every project has its own particular requirements or needs, right? So like yeah, like the compression and detail of something like Bughouse, which is like a postage stamp compared to Civilization to Nation, which is this vast, spectacular musical about the history of performing arts in South Asia, where we wanted to really deliver a kind of spectacle, and a I like that you pointed out the shot, the image of with the lights shining into the house of the theater, because we definitely wanted the audience to connect to what's happening on stage and for it to feel vast. That it's the opposite of Darger's like incredibly constrained world to this hugely expressive world of Civilization to Nation, and then. David Byrne's theater of the mind, because it's immersive. It's kind of a hybrid of what you do on film and what you do in theater, because the sets, it's experienced in real time, in real space, but the sets are 360 degrees. You need to feel like you're in the room. And some of those rooms were really real places, like we start in a nursing home, not a nursing home, I'm sorry, a funeral parlor. And then we move into the inside of a skull.
Mm,
An
mm.
abstracted space. And then we move into a disco, we move into a oversized kitchen where you feel like a child. So each space needed to completely, you needed to be completely immersed in, and you needed to feel like everywhere you looked, it was detailed and it was scaled to that scene. So yeah, so they're all really different. They all require really different ways of thinking about how you use space to tell the story, and they're all experienced by the observer in a completely different way. Like the most extreme difference I think is film and television. I mean, film and theater. Like they're just completely the audience, as you pointed out earlier, experience them differently. And then when you get into these kind of more immersive pieces, it's kind of there's some blending of the techniques you use and the way you create space. And in an immersive piece, you need to detail the set the same way you would detail a film set. It needs to, the human eye can be right there, look at every detail. So you need to show that you've thought out all of that. And that it supports the story. That's
Yeah.
always the most important thing.
Yeah, and for you, like as an because you're and you have an architectural background, but you also like you do like the sculptural and design and stuff. Is there art that you keep to yourself too? Because you're like, this is too personal. Like I only have it in like my home, or is there like moments where you're maybe perhaps thinking of creating a piece for a film or a project, and you're like, actually, I think I want to keep this for myself. This I don't want to put this for the film. I don't want to put this for a show. I don't want to put this for production. You're like, you know what? I'm going to come up with a different design, because this actual design is something that I think resonates more with me personally. And I don't want to necessarily share it with the world in that way.
Oh, that's a good question. I've never really thought of that before. Well, certainly like there are, details of my own like living space that feels very personal. I don't think I would ever put that on camera, you know, like certain, like we all collect things that are meaningful to us. So there might be like certain works of art or certain photographs or like, yeah, like there were certain, it's funny, we uh on Unaccustomed Earth, our characters are all immigrants mostly from Bengal, from India, but other parts of India. And we needed to show like images of grandparents, like to decorate the rooms, family photos. So a lot of people in the cab brought in their personal pictures that we could clear. And I had some too, and I put some on, but there were some that I was like, no, this is too personal. This is a picture of my dad from a moment that like, I think I don't want that. There's nothing embarrassing about it. It's just like that's too close to my life, and I don't want to share that particular image.
Yeah, you don't want to put it for consumption, right? For
Yeah.
consumption by strangers, which is like the enigma. The thing that's I think one of the things that fascinates people about artists like Gardner or Thomas Kincaid, or even like Van Gogh is like another, and so many other artists where they feel so intensely personal, an intense personal connection to their art on a very psychological level. And we as people on the outside, we be like, but your art is beautiful, like share it with the world, and then after the fact that a lot of it does get shared with the world, they go on exhibitions and tours around the world and all these kind of stuff. And sometimes you think to yourself, but these were never meant to be observed.
Yeah, well, that's like the Darger. Like I mean, we'll never know. Like, did he even want them to be shared?
Yeah.
Were they purely made for himself? I mean, he didn't destroy them, so that's one indication. But though he's quite elderly at the end, period. But yeah, we don't know. I mean, obviously, an artist, a contemporary art, most artists want to share their work and they want it to be seen. They want recognition. But especially these outsider artists, it's very hard to understand who they're made for. Who is the audience?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that fascinates me about human beings. Like, we are such fascinating creatures, and there's all of these dichotomies and contradictions to who we are as people. Like, we create beautiful art, but then it's like, I don't want to actually share the beautiful art. Or you do, like, you write a beautiful story, and like, again, the story never becomes popular until after you die. And like, I think I was thinking about Zora Neale Hurston this week, and like, there was a documentary I watched about her life of like last year. And like, she's now known as this profoundly prescient writer and understander of like human nature and language and culture. But she died in poverty. She died. She died in poverty because she didn't have anyone to look after her, and her work wasn't really. Her work fluctuated in popularity, so she wasn't like, she couldn't sustain her career. And like, and the thing about humans, like, we only sometimes realize the value of something until the creators have already passed on. And they don't get to see our appreciation. So for like you as a creator, like, you get to see people appreciate your art. People go to a theater and they watch your films, and you get reactions from the audiences. You get reactions from the actors, the writers, the directors, and and like people who interact with your work. You get to see them have that reaction. And I want to ask you about that. About thinking to yourself, like, you created this thing, and you get to see people actually appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I mean, especially in theater, because it only exists, theater is totally ephemeral. Like, it will only exist in those performances, right? So the way when you feel an audience appreciating it or being affected by it or being moved by it, that's incredibly rewarding as an artist, as a creator, I think. And the same, like, it's always thrilling when you see, especially when you've seen a film you've worked on and you see it with an audience for the first time. It's an amazing energy, and you experience the film with the audience for the first time, and kind of that's also I mean, that's why I hope people keep going to movie theaters, because it's very different to see a film with other people than it is by yourself. So, and then of course the other thing that's, I love, doing both forms, because the nice thing about film is it does last beyond I mean, theater can only exist in its moment, but film can
Unless it's cats.
Play it. Yeah. Unless it's cats, then it'll be seen for our great grandchildren, right?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? And that's the other thing about Broadway and stage productions in particular. Like you said, like, film is, if you keep it on physical media, and I'm all an advocate for it, please keep your film in physical media, VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, flash drive, because it's disappearing. These companies are here trying to literally erasing people's years of hard work. Keep your DVDs and your thing. But the thing is, film allows us to keep these memories. Taking pictures allows us to keep these memories. The thing with production design, on the other hand, is they're very limited. Like, things exist, and you do a production for a finite amount of time, and that's it. Again, unless it's like Cats or Phantom of the Opera, which like goes on for like 20-30 years. But like, even then, like, it's like audiences have only this one moment, and even like some people, they might never get to a Broadway show, but we can interact with it by watching like the video clips on like online, and like we can see it, but we are not seeing it in like the theater. And that's the other thing about film. Film is meant to be seen in a theater on screen, whereas stage productions are meant to be seen in the auditorium live, right? So like you have a very different interaction with it, seeing it on screen on like film or whatever versus seeing it on live in the auditorium.
Absolutely. And also the film is a fixed thing, right? It's a fixed work of art. So you experience the filmmaker's intent like that. Theater is, the performances change. The different one night can feel really different than the next, same performance, because the interaction between the audience and the performer creates a different result, right? So that actually, and then in the like in David Byrne's piece, Theater of the Mind, you have a guide who's an actor who takes you through the experience, and there's like 10 of them because we're always cycling different.
They're all Davids, right? I think that's what it is.
Yeah, they're all Davids. And so, but like depending on the performer, you have a completely different experience. So and then depending on the group you're with, what's kind of interesting in immersive work is the audience affects the piece. So depending who you went with or who are the other participants, you have a completely different experience. But then even film, which is fixed as a thing, like you'll talk to someone about a film and they'll have a completely different reaction to it, right? Or, they a completely different interpretation of it, or something that really moved you might leave someone else cold. But that's our complexity as humans, but that's what makes it interesting anyway, I think.
So we'll begin wrapping up soon. So I have two final questions for you. So I visited some of the different websites where a lot of your work is like displayed, like for like the projects that you worked on, and I noticed something interesting. On some websites and like on your own website, like your work is described, you're a production designer, whereas on some sites you're called a scenic designer. And I wanted to ask you if there's a difference in the terminology, or if that's just like maybe perhaps a stylistic choice for the websites, or is it like scenic designers there's something slightly different or like a slightly different intent or requirement for a scenic designer versus a production designer?
Well, production designer is really, I think, traditionally production design is specific to film and television, to something made for camera. It just came out of the industry, I think I forget when the first time production designer was used. I think it's Gone with the Wind. Anyway, film historian will know. Before it would just be called art direction or decor sometimes in older films. But I think when in modern filmmaking, the production designer is in charge of the whole everything the camera looks at, right? So the scenic design would just refer to the sets, but production design is choosing the locations, the graphics, the everything, the look of the film. So I think it's more appropriate to call, when you're working on a film or a TV show, or to be called a production designer. And that's sort of the industry standard, is production designer. In theater, it's either set designer or scenic designer. I actually chose to be production designer for BUGHOUSE because there were so many different elements. There was filmed media, animation, then that had to be put together by a projection designer. There were there was the set decoration and all the props. So in that case, because I was coordinating all of those things, I wasn't just in my own lane doing the set. I chose to production design because I think it reflected more clearly what I'd done. But traditionally in theater, it's a set designer, and it's like you just do the set. I mean, not just the set. The set's huge, but that's what you've done. And in production design, you have you're sort of the head of all of these other departments.
Okay, so I do have to ask, because this is just a little bit into my work as like some of the word that is a critic. I talk a lot about the economics of filmmaking and like Hollywood economics. I want to ask you about that. Does that also impact like the pay scale that is like available depending on the budget of the project? Because there's going to be different budgets for each project because of like the scale of the project and everything. When you're considered a production designer versus a scenic designer, is there like a difference also in like the pay scale or the pay rate, like perhaps like the industry standard or union standard?
Yeah, there are union minimums in all of the different. So depending on if you're working on a feature film or television series, and there are different budget levels, and the union minimums are based on that. The same with theater, depending, like obviously if you're doing a Broadway musical, the fee is much larger than if you're doing a small play off Broadway or so forth. And then, of course, depending on your experience and reputation, you might command a much higher fee. And then in films, if you're working on a extremely large, but a $200 million film, of course in film you're paid a weekly rate, you're not paid a single fee. So your weekly rate will be much higher than if you were working on a $20 million film, for instance. It is. And it would also depend who you are. So those things are all variable depending on the budget of the production. And then we in our careers establish our rate. So it's unless you've decided to work on something very low budget that you love and you're going to discount your rate to do that, you always try to ask for the same or more than you were previously paid. So
okay, that's interesting. And so that's good to know. So for my last question, this is going to be a nerdy question for you. I want you to talk about what is your favorite film production design and favorite set production design that you have not done, like from a project that you're not related to. Like, what would be your favorite production design in any film and your favorite production design in any musical or stage production?
Oh, really good question. Well, in theater, I love all of Robert Wilson's set designs, particularly. I loved his most famous one's Einstein on the Beach, which I saw the revival like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So that would be my favorite. In film, my favorite production design of all time. Oh, that's so tough. There's so many that I love. But I'm just trying to think most recently. The most recent one that I really, really loved was, and I'm spacing, the Yorgos Lanthimos they're all with Emma Stone.
I was just going to say, are they all with Emma Stone?
Well, the one with the ship and the oh God, sorry.
Was it the most recent one, the one that she won the Oscar for last year? Was it last year?
It's so embarrassing that I can't remember.
Listen, don't worry. My brain is terrible.
My brain is a little.
You mean the one from last year, right? That's which one?
Poor Things. Sorry.
Poor Things, right? Yes.
I loved Poor Things.
Oh, okay. I still have yet to see that film. I will get to it eventually. That's the beauty of film. I can get to it eventually. I haven't seen that one. Let me see.
I loved it because it's so designed. I mean, I love production design that kind of pushes the boundaries of like sometimes production designs and they have to exist in reality. They have to be plausible spaces where the characters could actually live for you to believe the story. But I love when you have the opportunity to, and you do a little in period films as well, because it's period. No one knows what 1830 looked like. You have to invent it, right?
Yeah.
So, but when you get into spaces that are more fantastical, and more stylized, I always am attracted to that.
Yeah, for me, for one of my all-time favorite films, but one of my favorite films for production design is a film called Shadow by Zhang Yimou, and it came out in 2018. And I love the production design of this film because it's not brutalist architecture per se, because it's set in ancient China, like Tang Dynasty China. But the way how a lot of interior shots take place inside this palace, and this palace is very much stone, so it's not like super decorated. It's like a lot of it is stone, and so it's like hard and soft, because there's a lot of the props are actually like curtains, like silk curtains that hang down. So they provide like this soft juxtaposition of softness versus hardness for the stone. And then there's this exterior, a lot of it is water because there's a lot of rain, but then there's like green from the forest. And one of the reasons I love this film is like it's very desaturated in color. It's not a black and white film because there's elements of color that happen in very strategic points. But I love this film because I love how he talks about softness versus hardness, because he's talking about the relationships between men and women. So like the women it represents the soft elements and the men represents the hard elements. But then you get to the end of the film and you realize that's not actually true, that the women are actually the toughest element in the film, whereas the men are more fragile. So I love how he kind of flips it around using just the production design and like the lighting. And one of my other favorite films is a film called Lady Vengeance by Park Chan-wook. Everyone knows his film Old Boy, but his second film in that series.
I haven't seen that. I'll see that.
You should watch it. Lady Vengeance to me is a perfect film because like you literally have no idea where this film is going. I consider it his best film. It is better than Old Boy. But one of the reasons I love this film is the production design. Light plays a big part in his production design. There's a lot of with regards to like shadows and where the camera moves and what the set design and looks like, especially like there's some of these fantastic overhead shots of like long shadows of like how like he uses like windows and lighting to cast like really long shadows on the wall, whereas the characters are really small in the space. So I love how he kind of like uses lighting to change the almost like the aspect ratio, not just of the film, but the characters themselves. Like he changes a lot. The characters change like size based on like how the camera is used and like the lighting. So it's like a really beautiful film. It's about vengeance and it's about death. But I think it's a really beautiful film. And like I love like Shadow is just a stunningly beautiful film. So if you get a chance to watch both films, because I
will. What was the first one again?
So the first one is Shadow by Zhang Yimou.
Shadow, okay.
So he's if you know the film like Hero, like he did the film like Hero years ago with Jet Li. Like
I know that film.
He's known for his martial arts film, and Shadow is a martial arts film, but I think this is one of his most stunningly beautiful films. And all of his films are like, the stories might not be the strongest, but he and his production designers and his cinematographers, that's where the films excel. And then the second film is Lady Vengeance by Park Chan-wook.
All right.
Yeah.
Good. I have my list.
They're like, I love Shadow. Shadow is like one of my favorite theater experiences because I saw it at TIFF and everyone was having like a blast in this film because you're like, what the hell is happening? What is going on here? But it's amazing.
It's called Shadow.
Yeah, Shadow, SHADOW. It's like fantastic.
All right.
I'm sure you can find it online somewhere. But thank you so much for taking the time for talking to me.
Yeah, thank you. It was really fun to talk to you.
And I can't wait to watch Drag and be creeped out.
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, I think so. People, it's a lot of fun, especially if you like horror, you're going to like it, I think.
Horror, but I also don't like body horror, but I also don't like sharp edges, but I'm also intrigued by films that use sharp edges.
There are some sharp edges.
Oh my God, it stresses me out because there's another film that I saw recently. I saw it at Sundance about 2 years ago. It stars Lucy Liu, and it's almost a single take film, but the camera keeps moving through, but it's like a really interesting film because of how the house is a character and the lighting is the lighting gives us the idea of who this house is as a character. So like Drag is giving me that sense because I'm kind of interested now because seeing the production notes and like the sketches and everything, I'm interested to see how it all comes together, kind of like a puzzle, you know. So I'm looking forward to Drag for sure.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Neil.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. Have a nice day or evening. And
all right. Yeah, it's evening now. I'm gonna go walk my dog because she's here. Like she came in. It's time to walk.
I have to walk mine too.
And it's raining here, so my dog hates water. I don't know. This might be a battle to get her outside. We'll see.
All right. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.